All right, so with that, I think that's all the preliminary stuff. So let me go ahead and introduce the topic of tonight's discussion, and then introduce our speakers. So the title of this event, of course, is America's Public Forum, Practical Politics for Political Minorities. And we in Braver Angels, of course, have a mission that is not really directly related to that, right? Braver Angels' mission has always been to bring people together across the political divides. Doesn't matter if you're the majority or the minority, doesn't matter what the parity is there. And it's also not necessarily about practical politics either. In Braver Angels, we don't specifically focus on trying to find policy compromises. We don't specifically focus on trying to find better messaging for political groups. We look at ways that we as individual citizens can come to better appreciate each other and better engage ourselves in politics. But that being said, practical politics and the existence of being a Republican in a largely Democratic district, or a Democrat in a largely Republican district, or some other political minority in a place where everybody else thinks a different way than you on some things, those are relevant to Braver Angels in the sense that those make you realize the need for some of the skills that we've learned, right? And they make you kind of start to understand on your own front without necessarily having gone to our workshops, without necessarily having gone to our work. The need for ways of expressing yourself and for ways of working with people very different from you that start to look a little bit more like the things that Bill Doherty's workshops and John Wood Jr.'s speeches have been showing us for a long time. And so we are joined tonight by two folks who are something of political minorities in the districts that they live in and in the parts of the country that they live in, to talk about number one, their experiences as somebody who is very much in the minority on a lot of things, but number two, as people who have worked in politics, as people who have run campaigns and worked with policy advocacy on the ground, with their local governments, with the local political parties, and been able to practice those skills and been able to use the lessons that they've picked up over time for not just the purpose of bringing people together, but for getting things done in politics itself. And so I'm excited for that. As a full disclosure, I am a Red. I have been a registered Republican in the past. And once upon a time, when I was a college student at the University of Southern California, the local Republican club, all five of them in the particular part of Los Angeles I was living in, recruited me to run for the California State Assembly in that district, which was a very, very, very blue district. And I was an idealistic college kid who was like, yeah, I will go ahead and do this. And for all kinds of reasons, I didn't get enough signatures to actually show up on the ballot. So I avoided humiliating myself on that front. But I think it would have been really good for me to have talked to the speakers that we're about to hear from before I had done that, because they have been in situations like that and worked with people in situations like that and figured out ways not only to maintain their dignity, not only ways to maintain their honesty, but even sometimes to win. And I think that's one of the interesting things about the questions of practical politics. And so over the course of this conversation, we'll cover a lot of things. We'll cover stuff from what it's like to work in parties, what it's like to do this kind of local campaigning work, and what it means to compromise on things that you really value. But we'll also talk about the particular situations of the geographies they live in. And we'll also talk some about how all this relates to broader American political thought. There's a lot of people in American history who've thought about this, and Elizabeth and Michael have engaged with some of those thinkers as well too. So it's both a practical thing and an intellectual thing. So anyways, without further ado, let me introduce our two speakers. Our first speaker is Elizabeth Dahl. Elizabeth, please wave your hand. Elizabeth is a conservative who has worked in Republican politics in Western Washington. She has been a chair, is it a board member, a committee member?
Yes, all of those things.
She has held many roles in the Republican Party of Washington State and the Republican Party of Kitsap County. Worked on a bunch of campaigns, even won some of them, and done a lot of stuff from political communications to campaign management and everything in between. And additionally, for those of you who've lived in Washington State, you'll know that it is a fairly blue area. I myself grew up in Kitsap County, where Elizabeth now lives, and it was not the most conservative place I've ever been. So we are delighted to have Elizabeth here with us to both to represent something on that front, but also to represent herself and her own story and her own experiences as well. So Elizabeth, welcome. Our other guest is someone who's been involved in politics with the Democratic Party for some time. As a nominal liberal in North Carolina, in the town of North Wilkesboro, North Carolina. His name is Michael Cooper, and Michael Cooper is joining us from down there. He is now, full disclosure, he is a candidate for the mayor of North Wilkesboro, North Carolina. Just to be entirely clear, that is a nonpartisan race. So he's not running as a Democrat, but he's worked as in the North Carolina Democratic Party and in obviously the issues that come up in the largely Republican and largely rural part of North Carolina that he lives in. And aside from having worked in that, he's worked in a bunch of national networks that focus on issues that have hit Appalachia particularly hard. Things like the opioid epidemic, things like the revitalization of Appalachian towns, and so has been not only an activist in his hometown, but has been part of a broader network of folks affiliated both with the small towns and with the nonprofit community to try to figure out how to bring back some of the former glory and greatness of Appalachian America. So he's and also additionally he's just a good guy and a good friend of ours at Braver Angels and a good friend of mine. Before I forget as well, Elizabeth Dahl has been a volunteer for Braver Angels' programs, including this one, the America's Public Forum program. And so for this event tonight, I just figured, we have a lot of people who are big names coming in from Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles and different parts of California. But we also have some real insight and real talent among the people who work with us at local levels as well. And so in the interest of bringing some of their insights in, I would just like to formally welcome Elizabeth Dahl and Michael Cooper to America's Public Forum. You two, thank you for joining us tonight. All right, sorry for the long introduction. With that, we will go ahead and get started into this event. So, Elizabeth, let's start with you. So, just take about 5 minutes. Tell us some stuff about your background. Tell us what your political identity is, what your political experiences have been, what's made you what you are, and why you've been working as in politics the way you've been working there. So.
As you mentioned, I am Elizabeth. I currently live on Bainbridge Island, which is across the Puget Sound from Seattle, but I grew up about an hour drive south of here in between Port Orchard and Gig Harbor, which is South Kitsap area. And I have been engaged in politics for the last decade at this point, pretty actively all over the state. I identify myself as a conservative Republican with libertine leanings. I am more of a philosophical conservative. I would say that my real active time period began when I was 17 and got recruited by a friend to come intern on a congressional campaign where he was the campaign manager, and got dropped in eyeball deep as a teenager who was also doing dual enrollment college classes full time and who was also in the process of escaping an abusive household. So it was a crazy time in my life, and I discovered a lot of things, namely that my Black and white thinking that I'd previously adhered to naturally didn't quite work to actually A, win elections, and B, advance my political philosophy and my political goals locally or on a wider scale. And C wasn't really helpful in my personal life to changing my situation either. And so I learned to be better. And I learned very quickly what was actually effective and what wasn't, and how it all worked, why it worked the way that it did, and was hooked. I found out three things in politics. A, I really enjoyed it. B, I was good at it. And C, I could get paid for it. And thus, I am still here 10 years later. I now work for a socially conservative lobbying organization as the team coordinator and office manager. So I 50-50 keep the wheels on the bus and then get to provide long-term communications and strategy as well. And then, as Luke mentioned, I've also done a lot of political consulting. Last year, I managed 4 campaigns, including two legislative races and a county commissioner race and a judicial campaign. So I run the gamut of political experience in Washington State, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Well, we will look forward to hearing a little bit more from you on that, because there's a lot there as well. But let's go over to Michael. So Mike, tell us what your background is, what got you to politics, why you are what you are in politics, and why you've kept doing it.
Those are great questions. It's great to see everyone here this evening. Thank you for taking the time and being a part of this. This is such a joy. So Luke has been to my hometown. I grew up in one of the great places, in this chorus of the Union, the small town, North Wilkesboro, North Carolina. For those of you who don't know, we were one of the original NASCAR tracks with a NASCAR race, and we were the birthplace of Lowe's Home Improvement. We had the very first, they started out as North Wilkesboro, Lowe's North Wilkesboro Hardware. And so we had that, and we had a lot of furniture and textile factories as well. For me, it was a great place to grow up. It was sort of both rural and also suburban, and I couldn't have asked for anything growing up as a child. Our dad worked for Lowe's, mom was a school teacher and owned a used bookstore. And so having that bookstore in the family really it opened up the world up to me and gave me intellectual curiosity. I grew up reading about, the presidents and American history, and, developed this love for these things. And, dad was this, Reagan Republican. He didn't really talk about politics much, but just a very enthusiastic, optimistic guy, Reagan type Republican. Mom was more of a Democrat. She grew up very rural, grew up on a farm, the youngest of 9 children, on a cattle farm. And, sort of had this deep empathy that came from that. I remember going to a funeral up at the farm for an uncle that had passed away. And one of our other relatives was talking about him. And he said that his sort of rule in life was, you don't look down on anybody else and nobody looks down on you. You're not better than anybody, nobody's better than you, which is sort of just, this fundamental, view of politics that, we're all equal and all in this together. So I inherited that. That was sort of my my upbringing. I originally registered as a Republican during college because it was a very Republican place. My county has never voted for a Democrat for president. At least that's Andrew Jackson. So it goes way back. And I went off to college, got involved in liberal politics, worked for Howard Dean's Political Action Committee, interned for Congressman Keith Ellison, worked for the Hip Hop Caucus doing voter registration, which was, a interesting path for this kid from Appalachia. But then, like a lot of young people who come out of my part of the world, I got caught up in the drug epidemic, the prescription drug epidemic. Most of y'all know it as the opioid crisis. Dealt with that, got in trouble, went to jail, had to get my life back on track. And the easiest place to do that after I graduated from law school was to come back home. And so, my story is deeply tied to the place that I'm from, even though my politics are a little bit different. And I've also been instilled with a whole lot of gratitude and things like that. And so that's given, my own progressive politics a better understanding for others, having gone through that. So that's my story.
Well, thank you for that, Mike. And let me throw the same question at the two of you now, actually. So obviously you two have both come to politics and public life and public service through some personal experiences, as well as just interest as well. But you two have worked for people in campaigning world and in just general party official world at different levels. And I guess my first question is like, what's the biggest thing when you worked in campaigns, and maybe give us like some stories from some of those campaigns that you figured out about how like the nitty gritty of politics works, right? Not in necessarily House of Cards dramatic style, I guess, but like what are things that you think people should know about what political operators do based on your experience? Elizabeth, how about you go first?
Oh, put me on the spot, why don't you? So I'm going to say probably go back to 2010 with the advent of the Tea Party, the original tax day Tea Party. I found myself on the steps of my Capitol building in Olympia on April 15th, 2010, very upset about the bailouts and frustrated that it seemed like the common American people were getting the raw end of the deal, and wanting to hold my local representatives as well as congressional representatives accountable for that. And became very engaged in politics, started attending my local Tea Party, started attending monthly my local county Republican Party meeting. And it took a couple of years for me to get there. But once I actually started working on legislative campaigns and associating with the people that won those campaigns and knowing my electeds on a first name basis, I realized how much more complicated politics was than I had thought, particularly when you're in the minority. There is just not a lot that can be done when you are in a political minority. And a lot of people, at least here, like to see big shows of standing on principle. But when you have absolutely no voice in the legislature or in the governor's office, it's very difficult for that voice to be meaningful. And if you would like your candidates or your electeds to simply give good speeches on the floor, that's fine, and that is your purview. But I think that more people should know and recognize that it is difficult to get elected and it's difficult to win elections if you are very publicly and very loudly saying extremely controversial or unpopular things in a district where you need to win in order to gain a foothold in the legislature. And that requires some strategy, and that requires some long-term thought that isn't always helped by being extraordinarily loud and outspoken from the minority.
And after you had been at the Tea Party rallies in 2010, right? And I guess those went through 2011. So you started getting into politics, into party politics from there in your local area. Were there any particular like campaigns that you worked on early on, and any particular kind of issue areas that you worked on early on that like just put this in as a lesson for you?
So that's why I started with the congressional race that I got recruited to work on when I was 17 in 2012. Because prior to that, I volunteered on a few municipal races for a city council race and a mayoral race and a port commissioner race. But those are all such hyper local races and nonpartisan that they didn't bear any resemblance to a partisan legislative campaign, and have absolutely no bearing on legislative actions or anything like that. Whether people were in favor or against particular things was much less partisan at the municipal level than it was about people's personal feelings in the town, about people that were in charge of the project. Especially when you are talking about municipal nonpartisan politics, it's often a lot more personal than partisan.
Well, thank you for that. And Michael, let's go to you on that, because obviously you're running for a nonpartisan municipal race right now. But in your time that you've worked for various party officials and various groups, and in your time now running for mayor, what are some of the lessons you've picked up and you've realized about just practical politics that you think people who aren't necessarily as involved at that level should know as well?
Those are great questions. And to piggyback on that, I'm really thrilled to be running in a nonpartisan race where I get to knock on people's doors and talk about, fixing up our parks and, bringing more concerts to town and not necessarily, having to talk about ideological issues. But I think it's interesting. I think most people, this is a special group, the folks who are willing to come together on a Wednesday night and dedicate some time out of your schedule to do this. Most people maybe don't think about these things as much or as often, certainly not necessarily in terms of ideology. I think that's what a lot of folks who especially work in maybe Washington, D.C. and state capitals and things like that, who are political professionals, don't realize that most people don't think about politics in terms of ideology. It's more, does this person care about me or not? And so when they look at a politician on TV at a convention or things like that, they're not really listening to their 10-point plan to fix healthcare or things like that. They're getting a message of, does this person see me in their coalition? Do they care about me? Will they fight for me? Things like that. That's how, the sort of the average voter probably sees politics more often. And so my advice is to, I guess a good example is there's a reason why, Joe Biden was able to get through those primaries and become president. When it came down to the South Carolina primary, he had politics is less ideological than we think and more about relationships. It's also more transactional. So when he went down to South Carolina, it wasn't, here's my 10-point plan to fix, housing or fix criminal justice reform. It was, Jim Clyburn, you've known me for, 40 years, you trust me. And then also the relational aspect. And then it was, Jim Clyburn, what do you want? And Jim Clyburn says, if you get elected, Vice President Biden, here's the list of things that I want to make sure that you're doing. And Joe Biden probably understood that a lot better than some of the other Democratic candidates, that you have to have relationships, you have to have trust with people. And then, politics can be that sort of, it is a business in some ways of, there's that saying that the two things you don't want to see made are laws and sausages. When you're talking to people, they want to know what's in it for me, what are you going to do for me, and things like that. And so you're not necessarily, politics. I wish it was more the Lincoln Douglas debates and we get up there on the stump at the rally and, debate our ideals, but more often it's, what, do you care about me and what are you going to do for me? And I think having that understanding will give you, a good way of reaching folks in your own backyard.
Well, perhaps it's not a Lincoln Douglas debate, but we are at the very least now in a Dahl Cooper debate. So there's something good here too. I want to know. So on the note of the sausage making kind of dynamics in practical politics, as Biden observed it, I'm sure you've thought about it a lot as you've worked in Democratic Party things. Is there a point where that starts to hit at people's ability to be principled as well? Is there a part where people aren't just being practical and civil to make compromises? Is there a part where that results in people selling their souls for the sake of getting things done, do you think? Or what's your opinion on that?
I do think there's some of that. I mean, you want people, especially nowadays, there are a lot of people, I think, who are going into politics to be social media influencers. And, they want to go on cable news every night and they want to, put something on, Twitter or Facebook or what, that's going to get them a lot of attention, but they're not necessarily trying to do the actual work. It is good to have principles and to base yourself in those things. But, from my experience, if you want to accomplish those things and you want to get them done, you have to accept the world as it is and be able to work with people where they are. Being a progressive, one of my sort of gripes with people on the progressive side is that we sometimes have a tendency to condescend to voters, and we'll say, here's what we need to do for you, and we're gonna, get you out of poverty and stuff like that. And it's more just, folks just want to see that, you understand what they're going through. And another thing is, and I've noticed this here, you have to accept the issues of people where they are. So in a place like my part of the world, you can't really go to them and say, you need to care about climate change when folks are already dying from the opioid crisis, or that factory closed and their jobs were shipped away. They're already dealing with a crisis. They already have issues to deal with. And so maybe you're fired up about gun violence or climate change or things like that, but you also have to understand it's not that these folks don't care and that they're or anything like that. It's that they already have things that they're dealing with, and in order to communicate and make have a relationship with them, you need to understand what they're going through too. So I think that's important.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Michael. And let me go to same question to Elizabeth. So, is there a point where the process of pragmatism, the process of getting things done at a relationships level on the one hand, and a practical deal making level on the other hand, just to keep the ship sailing, does that lead to questions where people sell themselves out and sell out their principles for the sake of this kind of thing?
So if I can start by backtracking just for a second,
please.
I wanted to actually agree with something Michael said, which is that politics are relational and not always just partisan. You see that in knocking on doors. It's why knocking on doors is something that everyone does, and that in really contested districts they did even during the pandemic, because nothing is more effective at building relationship and ensuring that someone will vote for you than showing up at their door and talking to them. And it's not just about marking the right box, it's about them knowing that you are actually there also and feeling that you care. I don't generally think that there's too much selling of the soul. Again, actually, I agree with Michael on this. I think there certainly are in certain districts, especially where they're extraordinarily partisan, where someone might be elected primarily because they want to be a celebrity or because they have a lot of celebrity, and that doesn't make a good representative. A good representative should care about the district and care about what their voters care about more than they care about getting their picture on the cover of a magazine or getting lots of national news coverage. You should always, as a candidate, care more about being on the front page of your local newspaper that every one of your constituents reads, or that, being more realistic, that 45% of your constituents read, than you should be about being on the front cover of the Washington Post.
Michael, I saw you unmute yourself.
And just to touch on that a little bit, I think some of what these folks there's a when folks say the term career politician like it's a negative thing, Lincoln was a career politician. FDR was a career politician. Folks like it is okay. It is a good profession. People could go into that and spend their life and there's going to be a lot of horse trading along the way. There is going to be some, putting your principles to the side in order to advance the cause or to stay in the job sometimes. That is a part of it. And I mean, it's not necessarily the most idealistic and the thing that we most enjoy, but you need folks like Lincoln, like FDR, who come up and who go through that in order to, be the leader. There is a role for people who are involved in social movements, who are involved in, protest movements and things like that. You also want those folks who are in the back room, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, working out a budget or, a tax deal or something like that. Like that is a necessary obligation of these things that we do. So I think our role, as constituents, as people like that, is to get in their ear and say, here are the things that we believe in. It's their job there to understand, okay, what can I get done on this day? And if people don't like it, they have the opportunity to vote me out. But there's a necessary bit of that trading that's part of the job.
And I would like to, in response to people have the opportunity to vote you out. That is extremely important. Something that a lot of people promote and advocate for on the right for sure, and I think even I've heard some on the left, is term limits. But term limits are not actually a functional good in practical application. I have talked to consultants, I've talked to campaign managers in other states that do have term limits, and it's awful. It makes it more difficult to recruit candidates, and the only people that have longevity of experience in government are the unelected bureaucrats. And those are the last ones that you want running things. Those are the ones that you can't have the opportunity to unelect, that only the government officials can hire or fire. And so when you say you don't want a career politician, what you're actually saying is, I want someone that doesn't know what they're doing some of the time. That's not always true. There are people who are incredibly smart and incredibly bright and that are in it for the right reasons, and it's like drinking from a fire hose. And they'll be fantastic representatives, and we do want those people in. At the same time, I think it's a mistake to throw people out just because they've been there for a long time. I think that it is better to evaluate on the merits whether you think they have done an appropriate job of representing you as their constituent. And I wouldn't call the negotiation or the horse trading part setting aside your principles. If anything, it's holding your principles most tightly. Everything is a trade-off. I think being on the right, I tend to think that we understand that extraordinarily strongly. Everything is a trade-off. That includes your decisions that you make in legislature. And this is why I think people should always be very close to their elected officials, follow their elected officials, keep in contact with your elected officials, because they need to make trade-offs in order to advance their principles. You're not going to get 100% of the cookie. Sometimes you will only get 50% of the cookie. Sometimes you'll only get 40% of the cookie. But it's better than 0% of the cookie. And your representatives need to know what types of trade-offs you want them to make and when you don't want them to accept a trade-off. And the only way that they know that is if you keep in contact with them. I think something that some people underestimate is the effort that it takes to actually hear from your constituents outside of an actual election. So many elected officials, we have radio town halls, we have in-person town halls, we send out emails, we do public polling, we publish phone numbers for people to call in. We ask people to communicate with us at a state level, at a county level, at a city level. And 90% of the time, it's the same people that are contacting you day in and day out. And they're the activists, and they're not representative of most of your constituents, and you know it. But most of your constituents are really, really busy. They're living their lives. Their lives aren't politics. They don't have time to worry about the general day-to-day. Unfortunately, that's the most important communication that can happen, is that understanding with your elected representation, because they need to be able to know what you do or don't want, outside of you being really super upset when someone from their campaign knocks on your door, or at an election when all of a sudden you want to be represented by someone else. So there's one thing that I could say about the implications of pragmatic horse trading and decision making, it would be communicate with your elected representatives.
So I have a follow-up on some of this too, and let's go to Michael with it first. But Elizabeth, I want to hear your thoughts on this too. So you guys are talking about number one, practical politicians and the political operators who work for them both in the party structures, but also presumably in the legislative staffs and maybe some of the folks in the bureaucracies and the media institutions and stuff. But there's also obviously other political actors as well, right? You've got the grassroots mass movement kind of organizations that some people either optimistically or pessimistically call populist, right? And there are versions of those on both the left and the right. I think it's probably fair to say that the Tea Party was a very successful conservative populist movement, and I think it's somewhat fair to say, mostly fair to say, that the Democratic Socialists of America is a fairly successful liberal populist movement of a certain sort. And so those have a lot of media power, obviously, but they're not known for getting a lot of things practically done. And my question for both of you, and you can talk either about the one on your own side or both of them, whichever you prefer, is there any like value to the work that they do, even though they're not the ones who are compromising and doing the actual like getting work done that the parties are doing? Is there any value to like the kind of mass protest in the streets and the kind of mass media campaigns and the mass voter rollout of that sort? Do they bring anything useful to American politics that you guys from the insides of the policy world and the party world do they bring in stuff that actually like is something that you guys think is valuable? Michael, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah. The short answer is yes, absolutely. Real quick, I'm going to dig into this question to final thought on the last one. I don't know how many people here have seen the movie Lincoln that came out like 2012. Probably a good number of y'all. That is a great example of what we were talking about. That movie is not about the Gettysburg Address or the second inaugural. There are those important parts too about the great speechifying and the great ideals, but that movie was about him finding ways to get congressmen to vote for, an amendment and, buying them off with, the postmaster job in Millersburg, Ohio and things like that. Like that is the practical politics that we're talking about where it's a necessary part of what we're doing. But, to Luke's question on the folks in the street and the protest movements and things like that, I was in the streets of Raleigh, last summer during the George Floyd protest and, got to see that. That plays in, the country's changed in some interesting ways in the last year because of those conversations. It's remarkable, how much these conversations have changed and a lot of institutions that are rethinking a lot of things because of that. That plays an important role. I think what is not as helpful now is the way that social media amplifies all those voices. So where there were mediating institutions above it, in the past, now it's just sort of, any voice in any movement has as much authority now on social media as your local mayor or your county commissioner or your preacher or whoever. And that, I don't know. I don't know how long this is going to last, and I don't know how healthy that is in the long run. It is good that we are having these conversations about race, about justice, about other things like that that the movements are bringing to our attention. We've probably had more progress on some issues, but also bringing some issues to the forefront that we haven't had in years, and that's long overdue. And that's a good thing. At the same time, you don't want to have to think that I think it was Dr. King who said the riot is the language of the unheard. You want people to feel like they're heard, and you don't want to have to see riots and things like that in the street. So I think these are growing pains that we're going through, but I also feel like I want to see these people who are out there demonstrating. I want them to feel like they are inspired to run for office and get involved in a political party or other things like that, and go out there and actually grassroots organize, register voters, do the necessary things that actually really affect change. We're having these difficult conversations, but now let's actually see some solutions.
Thank you, Mike. Elizabeth.
Yeah, so whether they affect change, I think undeniably they do. I think culturally, street marches, street protests street riots can be extremely effective at producing cultural shifts and changes to how the general public thinks about a particular issue or reacts or responds to an event or an issue. I think that they are far less effective at influencing government or causing change in government. Government is intentionally a slow-moving entity. Government is supposed to calm the passions of the people and be deliberative as a body to determine whether a thing is actually a good idea on a policy level, whether that thing will be an effective policy to implement, whether that policy will actually positively affect the thing that everybody wants changed. And big demonstrations on the street are just not helpful to that in any way, shape, or form. I regularly see protesters or demonstrators on a variety of federal issues standing on the street corner right outside my condo. And I have to admit, every time I see them, because they are generally advocating for things that I disagree with, I'm like, oh, well, at least they're doing this. It makes them feel good. They could be a lot more effective other ways. If you want to be effective, show up in your legislator's office, communicate with your elected officials. As I said earlier, the best thing that you can do is talk to them. They want to hear from you. They want to know the perspective of the general public. And if they don't hear from you, they're not mind readers. They only know what they know from the people that talk to them.
One of the things I'm appreciating about this conversation, by the way, is that I think you two are articulating and in some ways demonstrating the fact that in American political culture, and in some ways even in American business culture and culture in general, there's a lot of splits, right? There's a lot of, it's not like you have any single group of people who monopolizes all influence and power, right? There are some who are more powerful than others, for sure. There are some institutions that are at the center of networks and others that are at the peripheries. But what you guys are showing, I think, is that there's not only in a question in the question of like local and county to states to federal, and not only in the question of Congress and the presidency and the courts, but even in terms of just the subdivisions within those. There's just so many different actors who have real influence on some things that in order to get anything done, you can't just proceed from first principles and get the perfect ideology. And you have a real kind of need to get coalitions together for any given thing. And I just think that's a really helpful kind of antidote to some of the ways our public discourse talks about it, So
I did want to add one more thing, which is that if you organize the same group of people that shows up to a public protest or demonstration to instead show up in your state representative's office or to show up on a hearing floor in the legislature, that will accomplish things. That will move your legislators. There are very few things that are more effective in terms of moving legislative policy than actually showing up in person. When groups show up en masse, because it is difficult to get people to show up, your representatives presume that every one person that shows up is representative of another 10 or more that agree with you, because it is that difficult to get people in person. So show up, be heard. Have I emphasized that enough times?
There's implications here for political theory, but we'll get to that in a minute. And I also want to let everybody know too that we're probably going to go to our question and answer session in about 10 to 15 minutes or so once we get through another segment of this conversation. But if you, as you start to have questions for the panelists and thoughts on the general stuff we're discussing, please be ready to start raising your Zoom hands once we get a little bit closer out here. So meantime, I want to take this a little bit back to the local as well. So Mike, obviously you're from North Carolina. Elizabeth, you're obviously from Washington State. And I think both of you are quite aware that your states are sometimes stereotyped as being more one thing than they actually are, right? Washington State has a lot of your kind of Starbucks drinking kinds of city dwellers and stuff, but it's not just that. There's also your lumberjacks. There's also your ranchers out in the eastern part of the state. It is a more politically diverse state, even though there still is a majority. And Mike, obviously, I mean, you're a liberal in the middle of rural North Carolina, but it's not just rural North Carolina. There's also the major tech hubs in the Research Triangle area there. And Eastern North Carolina, the spot, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, is where a lot of the barbecue culture that's associated with North Carolina comes from, and that's very different than Central and Western North Carolina too. So I was wondering if you two, and Michael, you can go first on this, can just give us a little laydown of, number one, your state, the local kind of cultural divides, maybe how some of that hits at some of the political divides, and things that you guys, well, you guys have worked at the local level, the way you've assessed, okay, how do I make partners? How do I make new coalitions in the state politics? Michael, you go first.
Sure, and I've got to do a quick barbecue shout out because Eastern North Carolina is not the only kind of barbecue in North Carolina. Also a great Lexington style, which is more on the western side of the state, which I'm closer to. And I got to give a special shout out. There's a friend, Isabel Soto, who's a friend of Braver Angels, on here as well, and she went to school at Davidson, so she probably knows all about the barbecue in North Carolina, and likes the Lexington style. But so real quick, North Carolina is a fast-changing state. It's one of the the fastest-changing states in the country. A lot of young people moving into Raleigh and Charlotte. The RTP, the tech hub there in the Triangle, and then Charlotte is a banking city, and people moving into work in the banks and everything like that. Around that, you have the second largest rural population in the United States, which is surprising to a lot of people. Behind the state of Texas, there are more rural people living in the state of North Carolina than anywhere else in the country. And North Carolina has the second most small towns, municipalities in the country as a state. So that is why our politics are the way that we are. You have, and it's interesting, for most of our history, the Republican pockets in North Carolina were Raleigh and Charlotte, where you had your wealthier sort of Eisenhower Country Club Republicans living, and then you had rural Democrats living in all the other the counties. And so North Carolina was obviously solid South, Democrat, from that history, and then the Republicans came up in these big cities, and that politics has switched because of the civil rights movement, because of other social things too, to where now you have 70 really rural Republican counties, and you have like 10 very deep blue urban counties, Durham, Wake, Mecklenburg, that are also giving like 70% of their vote to the Democratic candidate. And so there's a balance, and right now that's to the advantage of the Republicans, who get a slight majority in 2016 and 2020. We do have a Democratic governor, but the legislature is also Republican because of those rural counties and things like that. So we're kind of evenly split because things are changing so fast.
Thank you, Mike. Elizabeth?
Washington is extremely diverse. We've also seen our urban-rural divide become a little bit more pronounced over the last several years. Michael and I were talking about this a little bit before we started. Washington has actually fairly recently been extremely purple in terms of legislative power. As recently as 2014, we had a majority coalition caucus in the Senate, and we also had an outright majority by one vote. Is to say we have one Democrat who consistently caucuses with us. And for a time, we had as many as 3 Democrats that were caucusing with us to form a bipartisan majority coalition. And then in 2016, with Donald Trump, as some of the urban counties that had been soft red or very light blue turned deeper blue or flipped blue when they weren't before, those districts stopped being competitive for us, and we lost some ground. And the red districts became significantly more red, with the exception of some lumber districts. Lumber district out by the coast actually flipped in 2016 for Donald Trump. And like Michael noted, these were people that had long been Democrats. We're talking about voters who had been Democrats for 100 years. This district had not supported Republicans in an extremely long time because these were Union Democrats who were employed in the lumber and forestry industries. And in my state, the environmental activists, as opposed to the active environmentalists, really put those jobs through the ringer and caused a lot of them to go away. And that resulted in a flip on economics and in a, well, on a flip on jobs in that district. And then similarly, one district north of that in the 24th LD, the rural area, which had been the same sort of long old Democrat, also flipped to vote Republican. So now you only have the couple of cities that are in that legislative district that are still holding that district blue. This year they were blue, that district was blue just by the smallest of margin. I had two state legislative candidates who were at 49.9 and 50% even, respectively, in 2 out of 3 of the counties that make up that district. So it's very, very, very tightly split right now. And that is a split on jobs, because the Democrats in that area, in the rural area, that have flipped are still very socially conservative, oddly, and also supportive of some democratic policies in terms of employment and welfare. And so you see an interesting disparity between what had been the kind of philosophical conservatives that existed in the urban parts of the state that made up a lot of the majority caucus, where the state Republicans had been making extraordinary increases and inroads in the years leading up to Donald Trump's election as president, in flipping legislative districts on issues like school choice, on issues like the economy, where the left was just decimating based on campaigning for higher taxes and keeping minority kids trapped in impoverished school districts. Those issues that were very local and driven primarily by extremely specific, very high quality recruiting and relational politics, as we discussed earlier, all got swamped in the transition to Donald Trump. And those districts that previously in urban areas had been pretty competitive suddenly became a lot less competitive for Republicans.
It's just interesting thinking about this as I think about the places I've called home. I mean, I live in Northern Virginia outside of Washington, D.C. right now, but I follow Virginia politics a little bit, and I went to school in California. And so in some ways, Michael, the things you're talking about in North Carolina, just south across our state border, is kind of a funhouse mirror of sorts version of similar trends in the Commonwealth of Virginia too. And Elizabeth, I didn't spend as much time in Washington State as I did in California, but in some ways, I feel like some of the dynamics you're talking about in Washington are things that I remember watching in California to some degree as well, particularly in that time between about 2012 and 2015. And so it's just interesting because at some level, what you guys are showcasing is that there is more complexity in the way parties are formed, in the way ideologies and coalitions are formed, than I think a lot of people give it credit for. And for what it's worth, there's always somebody in Washington, D.C. in the publishing world who writes a book every 3 or 4 years, either from a red perspective about how conservatives need to be very afraid because the Democrats are going to steal all the future elections or whatever, or alternatively from a blue perspective about how liberals have to be very afraid because conservatives are able to trick rural voters into voting against their economic interests or whatever, just stuff like that. And if you look into the actual politics in the states, if you look at the actual folks working in the state parties, it's just so much more interesting than that, and I think it's also more fluid, and also maybe there's more agency for ordinary Americans to actually get into it, like Elizabeth's been harping here about ways to make your own community's destiny move forward, right? And so I don't know, there's a lot of stuff to hop into here that I'd love to chat on further APFs eventually. But I want to go to one last kind of question from my front before we open it up to Q&A. And actually, if anybody has had any questions burning for a while, or if there are things that you're hoping that the panelists will address. Go ahead and start putting up your hands. I'm going to ask them one last little set of questions, but we will go to Q&A right after that and spend the rest of the time in Q&A. So, my question for you two, though, Elizabeth and Michael, is so we obviously you guys have been in local politics and worked in party politics at a very practical level, but it's also American politics. And as anybody who has ever read the Declaration of Independence or any of the Federalist Papers knows, there's an intrinsic kind of need to rationalize that we Americans do with everything, and most especially our politics, right? But there's been some great political thinkers over the centuries who have figured out ways to think about some of these political issues that you guys were talking about. And so one of the things that I'm wondering is, so we're gonna be doing another APF with our friend Lexi Hudson in a couple of weeks here, on the thought and life of Alexis de Tocqueville. And Alexis de Tocqueville's is known for many brilliant thoughts about the nature of American democracy. But one of the ones he's known most for is the role of is the fact that we Americans tend to go set up civil society things that are not explicitly political all the time, although they can be, and are wind up being influential politically because there's a way in which they kind of set up a collective choice rather than a top-down imposition on citizens pursuing their own destiny. And so I guess my question is, to what degree do you think that kind of political reality of citizens coming together and deliberating to create a new and greater public good, to what degree do you think that is an ideal to be striven for, versus to what degree do you think that is the actual way politics works as you have watched it in the institutions you've worked in? Elizabeth or Mike, whoever wants to go first can take it.
Sure. Well, real quick, and Lexi has come to North Wilkesboro. She came to visit, so I can't wait to hear from her. She wrote a USA Today article about our town. You know, it's interesting, you know, living here in this small town in Appalachia. You know, we unfortunately became kind of the stereotype for, you know, this, you know, left behind or rundown place after losing a lot of the furniture factories. And even to the point where in 2016, we were on the front cover of the New York Times. Above the fold, there was this big picture of an abandoned factory and this, you know, headline about hopeless and, you know, left behind. It was kind of, you know, demoralizing. But what was interesting is, you know, going through that experience and seeing the politics of Trump, and, you know, Trump got 78% of the vote in this county. There are a lot of threats to Trumpism, you know, some of them, you know, healthier than others. And we'll save that conversation for another night. But one of the things that I saw in that was a feeling of a loss of control or a loss of influence over your own life. And you saw that not just here, but that's, you know, also in a place like, you know, the United Kingdom with the Brexit vote or things like that, of people feeling like, you know, I can't control what's happening on my street, what's going on in town, the jobs leaving, or the opioid crisis coming in. But you also see that in a place like Ferguson, Missouri, or a place like Flint, Michigan. You know, folks also there feel like I don't have control, or I don't have the voice that I thought I used to. And, you know, some of that's tied to that Robert Putnam stuff about, you know, the bowling alone and people spending less time interacting with their neighbors or going to the Rotary Club or the Elks Club or things like that. So I do think all those things are connected, and I hopefully that can be a solution. You do need more civic life and more civic engagement, not just in political parties and political work, but also just going to the neighborhood meeting and, you know, having dinner with the people who live, you know, down the street. I think those things are healthy. And our challenge is, in the digital age, when we're spending so much time, you know, scrolling through social media, how can we get those associations again? Because feeling like we're empowered, feeling like we're a part of something, we're going to look more to ourselves and less to, you know, some national figure to solve things for us. So hopefully that we'll get more of that.
Well, we shall see. Thank you for that, Mike. Elizabeth, same question.
Yeah, think that Michael has a lot right there in terms of people have lost a sense of community, and you need to have meaning in your life. And people have, in my opinion, begun finding meaning in their political philosophy. And that is not helpful to the end of actually advancing your political ideology. That's not actually helpful to advancing any policy goals. If you are emotionally attached to your policy goals, that's a goal that you cannot evaluate objectively. That's a goal that you have difficulty engaging in critical analysis of. That's a goal that you have, that you struggle to move forward with on any sort of rational basis with your fellow elected officials. And that's something that you can't even discuss over dinner with your neighbors. More importantly, talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends, rely on community, rebuild community. We have to be able to engage with each other, and you can influence your local community. You can start small. I live on an island, and I still go out to my city council meetings and testify at city council meetings sometimes, or more recently testify over Zoom, because that moves people and that can make inroads. Maybe I can't change a lot, because the reality is that my city votes about 75-25 against most of what I would prefer. But there is common ground to be found. There are inroads being made all the time on specific issues. And when you're talking about municipal elections, when you're talking about municipal issues, when you're talking about hyper-local things like who's going to fix the potholes in my street, and what can I do with my yard? Where can I put a shed in my yard? And how long can it stay there? Or how can I ensure that the city council won't put a path through my yard and force me to deed it to them when I sell my house? Those are issues that people can come together around. Those are things that are not so partisan as they are very personal. And they don't require a red or a blue identification. Those are things that you talk about over dinner. Those are things that affect your everyday life. And those are things that can be changed, and things that can be swayed by you showing up with one or two of your friends at a meeting once in a month. Like, talk to your city council people. It's not that intimidating. It's not that hard. They're just like you. You probably see them in the grocery store sometimes. You can make change. It requires camaraderie with your fellow human beings. It requires community with your neighborhood, with your neighbors, and it requires rebuilding those ties that I think we have in some form lost over the last, I think, several decades, and then accelerated pretty quickly recently.
Well, thank you for that, Elizabeth. And if I ever happen to live in Kitsap County again, and you happen to be one of my county commissioners or city councilors there, I will make sure to say hello to you in the grocery store while I'm there. We will, and by the way, Mike and Elizabeth, I might ask you guys a question later on this evening about George Washington Plunkitt of Tammany Hall, but let's get to Q&A first, and we will get to that later. So first question is going to our friend, Reverend Franklin Ruff. Franklin, good to see you.
Good to see you too, my friend. And this question is going to be for both of our esteemed guests. You are in a minority, which means there's a majority political viewpoint. When you look at where you live, what is most attractive? What do you think is most attractive for the people where you live about that majority viewpoint? And what is it within your viewpoint that you think the majority might find attractive?
That's a great question. Elizabeth, Michael, who wants to take it first?
That is a tremendous question. So, here in this sort of very Republican, very conservative part of the world, one thing that I really like about it is that it is a deeply patriotic place. And as somebody who grew up, reading about, the country's history and things like that, even though I'm very progressive and want to see the moral arc of the universe continue to bend towards justice, I have a deep love and respect for the work that has been done to get us here. And I am a very patriotic person, so that is one thing. Also, just we have a Baptist church on every street corner, and there's a lot of good that comes out of that about people caring for one another, and if your car breaks down on the side of the road, somebody's going to stop and somebody's going to help you. So sort of that just small c conservativeness and things like that, community values, I especially enjoy. I find that very attractive, and so that's it for me. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael.
So for me, city versus county have very different answers. At a city level, my city is very partisanly driven. They vote in lockstep in partisan races. If there is a D on the ticket, that is who gets their vote the vast majority of the time. Even when you get into municipal races, my municipal candidates will go seek the endorsement of the local progressive voters group. It is, and if you don't have that, you won't get elected. It is a very partisanly driven electoral process. That having been said, when you get into individual issues on a city level, when you are approaching it policy by policy rather than working around an election, there's a lot of openness to specific issue conversation in my city. And they're very driven by community responsibility, and community responsibility, the small c conservatism, despite their progressive political affinity, is something that's extremely attractive to them. It has been it has been interesting to me living here for the last 6 years to see that a lot of my neighbors, a lot of my community live their lives very traditionally and live their lives very much in line with how I live my life as a small c conservative. And that interdependence on each other as individuals within the community is something that is very attractive to my city as well as to me. Even if on an electoral level, they vote vast majority for the left. On the flip side, at the county level, it's very swingy. And what is valuable to them depends on what part of the county you're in, and what's attractive to them depends on what part of the county you're in. If you are in South Kitsap County, it is the economic stability, it is the affordability of housing, it is the safety of their families, and it is their ability to have enough land for them to raise a family and live the way that they want to live. If you are in the north end of the county, it is that they can commute quickly to Seattle and that they have a very safe kind of cloistered community, and that it cares about the environment really, really deeply, and that they feel very connected to the environment because something unique about Kitsap is that we are the county with the greatest amount, or the county in the US with the greatest amount of shoreline in the US.
Well, let me throw a question in there that I actually don't know what you guys think on from my prior relationship with you guys, but one of the common kind of refrains in a lot of discourse these days is get money out of politics, right? And there are a lot of different kinds of proposals about how to get money out of politics, be they like a greater disclosure of campaign funding or public funding of campaigns sometimes, or just outright bans on donations to political candidates over a certain level. And obviously, you two are working in an industry that hits that a lot more close to home, I think, than some things do. Can you say any of your thoughts on whether getting money out of politics in some of the ways people have talked about it either can work or is beneficial, or is it harmful, or what's your general thoughts on that? So, and Elizabeth, I said, oh, actually, Michael.
Oh, sure. So real quick on that, over the years, I feel like I've been one of those people who wants to see, the money out of politics and, things like that. I've sort of, I'm not sure how I feel these days. There was an interesting discussion I'd heard the other day on a podcast where the person was saying, look, if we got rid of the big donors right now and the big checks, the people who are going to be the most successful are these, are going to be the Marjorie Taylor Greens on the right and the most extreme people on the left who get the small dollar donation. So, I mean, you fix one problem and then it's just going to be the people who, go out there and say the craziest things on social media to get the small dollar. So I'm not sure anymore. I would love to see a lot of the money taken out of politics. I would love to see shorter election cycles. I'd love to see election day a national holiday. You get the day off. You go in there. You really get to spend time and see who's running and make educated decisions about these things. But I don't know. I mean, when you look at a place like the United Kingdom, they have a very short election cycle. It's like 2 or 3 months. They have very little money in politics. They still get crazy people who are elected. They still have their own political problems. We can have all the good solutions in the world to make elections better. Like at the end of the day, it's people making decisions and voting for other people. And, it's always going to be a messy business, no matter what, do-gooder ideas we have to fix it. And I think understanding that it's always going to be messy and let's just roll up our sleeves and embrace it and get dirty ourselves and be a part of it. I think that's the best thing that we can do.
Elizabeth?
So 2 things. One, how much time do we have to answer this question?
Well, if you can keep it under 5 minutes before we get to the next question, that would be helpful. But yes, and what's the second thing?
So the second thing is to start, actually, I agree with the vast majority of what Michael said. I think that pretty much you're never going to make it any less messy than it is. Money is fungible. It finds a way to come out. If you ban people from contributing big dollars to political candidates, you get a bunch of super PACs. You can't ban super PACs because that's actually freedom of speech. So says the Supreme Court. And I think that that was actually a correctly reasoned decision. I think the rationale is sound. And you see that from a lot of lawyers, even on the left, that are constitutional lawyers. Even if they don't like the outcome, they tend to agree that it was well reasoned. I've actually written pretty extensively about getting money out of politics and or our inability to do that. My position is generally actually that money in politics is helpful and money in politics is useful because money is speech and money is not just those really rich people. In fact, if you ban things like PACs, all you get is the really rich people that can afford to do it themselves. Those small donations count. And those small donations, to a slight quibble with Michael, they don't just go to crazy people. They don't. They really don't. Small donations go across the board to pretty much everyone. And some of your most popular politicians get the biggest number of small donations because they are that popular. So let's see how quickly I can get through this. Money doesn't usually, in my experience, flow to legislators to influence legislators to vote the way that the people that have the money want them to vote. Rather, money flows from people that legislators already agree with to those legislators in order to keep them elected. I see people all of the time say, oh, we need to know about this money because we need to know who's influencing them. In my experience, that's not how it works. You're not changing a legislator's mind with your money. You are ensuring that a legislator that votes some way that you already like stays elected. Secondly, extremely rigorous and onerous disclosure requirements can be a mixed bag because on one hand, you know a lot about who's giving money. On the other hand, as we see in California, that can be used to harass people that are in the minority viewpoint. And I expect that to happen at any moment here in Washington State. In fact, I can tell you as someone that works in politics here, it is already extremely difficult to garner campaign donations to candidates from big names or from companies because they are terrified that even supporting a moderate Republican, they will face huge amounts of backlash because disclosure requirements mean that everyone will know who they supported. And it's not about a candidate being super evil, it's just about a candidate belonging to the wrong team. Secondly, onerous disclosure and reporting requirements are bad for small candidates. The people that can keep up with onerous requirements, same problem that you have with complicated tax code, the ones that can afford the expensive lawyers or the expensive CPAs to do all of the reporting that's required by the law, to correctly interpret the law and then correctly argue and win arguments with the governing body when they do make a mistake or claim to have made a mistake, are really, really difficult for the municipal candidates, for your county candidates, and even for your ledge candidates, who in a lot of states are not paid as much as you'd think. For perspective, I currently make more than all of my state legislators. We have a quote unquote part-time legislature, but if you are in a competitive district, you are working more than full-time. This is an 80-hour week thing that never goes away. Even when you're not in the legislature, when you're not in session, you are campaigning all the time. Your House members have to get reelected every 2 years. They are never not working. They don't get paid the way that you think they get paid. That was kind of a side note, but I think it's important. Also, everyone can contribute to PACs. PACs are the average person's way of being able to ensure that their voice is heard at the governing level. Your state representatives, your congressmen are way too busy to be able to actually hear from every single individual person. And as Michael said, your average person is not following politics very closely. It is not their life. Their life is at home. They don't have time, they don't have the energy, they're not putting the effort into following every single bill, but they can contribute $5 or $10 or $15 or $25 along with 10,000 other people in their state or in their industry in order to pay someone whose job it is to do just that. And that isn't a bad thing. In fact, that's a good thing, because that person that's being paid by all of those people is still representing an actual opinion that exists. That money is representing all of these people that couldn't do it themselves as individuals. And it's coming in the form of a PAC, it's coming in the form of a paid lobbyist, it's coming in whatever form that it takes, that isn't all of these individuals having to sacrifice either A, mass amounts of money to pay their own lobbyist, or B, mass amounts of time and thus their own personal money and property and effort to influence government themselves.
I hope you guys are okay with me using this term, but I am loving you guys' wholesome ruthlessness. Michael, you opened your—
Yeah, real quick to touch on that. One thing I would love to see, though, I think it has been to our detriment that we have sort of weakened political parties in the United States. I would rather have strong political parties that sort of can mediate and can pick and choose candidates and can help to curate those things than what we have now. Plus, I do think it is a problem, and the money in politics is going to be there. I don't like seeing, if you're a congressman, having to spend 30% of your time in DC, dialing for dollars in a second office and doing that call time all the time. I would love for let's put the money through the political party. The political party raises the money. The political party spends the money. The candidate, if they get selected by the party, gets that money to spend, but they don't have to spend the time raising the money. I would love to see that. I don't know if that's doable, but I do think it'd be beneficial for, if our elected officials are elected, let's get them spending more and more of their time, thinking about issues and solving problems than having to, call people and ask them to max out every cycle. I think that'd be helpful.
We'll go to Rita's question in one moment, but Mike, could you explain a little bit in more detail what you mean by stronger political parties, and also what you mean by the parties are weaker nowadays as well?
Sure. So you're probably a better, scholar on this than I am, but, going back to, the 70s and things like that, there were all these reforms that sort of, they added primaries to the presidential process of how you select presidents, but also just, in terms of who gets to decide, who's the candidate and who runs and what are messages and things like that is more It's more dispersed. It's not central. There are very few sort of smoke-filled rooms making the decisions right now in these two political parties. And I feel like you probably would have less extremism. You would have less sort of, disruptions and things like that if you did sort of have more power and decision making. I would love to have conventions where you pick the candidate at the convention and things like that. Bring that back. Lincoln and FDR were both picked at a convention. They turned out pretty well. Let's support that.
Thank you, Mike. Elizabeth. Yeah.
So I have kind of a warning in response to that, which is I have been there with strong parties in Washington state, and then we have gone the other direction. Michael is right in one sense. When the parties are in charge, they have a real emphasis on ensuring that stable people are elected, that people who are going to be excellent contributors to the caucus or to the legislative body or to the governing deliberation of the area are the ones who will make it through the primaries, are the ones that will be elected as representatives of the party. You cut down on a lot of the extremes because these are people who want to be reelected. They're people who want to maintain some level of input or influence in state government. They want to maintain or regain a majority. The downside of this is that people get really, really, really mad when they feel like the state party is putting their thumb on the scale. Washington state, this happened. We used to have a fairly strong party that picked favorites and would weigh in the form of early money and endorsements to their chosen person. And that was good in terms of electability, but over time it made a lot of grassroots, a lot of constituents very, very angry because they felt like they weren't actually being heard, that their concerns weren't actually represented well by the party's quote unquote chosen candidate. And thus the party now has gone the other direction. And in 2020, it did not put its thumb on the scale at all. And it withheld making any early endorsements. It didn't give any early money and let the people choose. The downside to that was that we had an absolutely terrible candidate who did, I believe, the second worst in state governor history. So I'll go back to everything as a trade-off. And I tend to err more on the side of giving power to the people, and the people deserve the government that they vote for. And if you don't like the result of what you voted for, then change how you vote. I don't think that we should generally take power away from the people because we think that they made a bad decision. I think it's up to constituents and grassroots and people on the ground to learn from mistakes.
Let's go to a question from Rita Chisholm. Rita, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. I want to thank, I'm sorry, the lighting in here is not very good. I want to thank both of the speakers. You're very interesting. I'm learning a tremendous amount from both of you. A lot of practical things, which are really important to me because to Elizabeth's point, I was one of those that was rarely involved in politics before things just got so ugly. And thankfully, through Braver Angels, I've really made it a point to be more informed. I do a lot of reading to try to, figure these things out. But one of the curious things that I had to ask about was one of the hot button issues for me personally is the critical race theory. And I know there's been just so much that has been talked about on that. There's a lot of reporting that goes on about that. And I'm trying to, delve a little deeper to get a deeper understanding rather than just what we hear on media, or I don't personally interact with social media, but I've done a whole lot of reading. One of the things I'm curious about, though, when I think about the communities that I live in, you know, it's one thing when I see things about CRT on the media, and it seems to be coming from, and I could be mistaken, but larger areas, you know, bigger cities and that type of thing. What in your experience in the communities that you live in, is CRT very much of an issue for people in your communities, or is that just something that we're seeing more of on national TV?
And if I can help frame this a little bit too, thank you for this, Rita. To make it even a little deeper into the theme of tonight's question, one of the things I think that's relevant in this is like, are some of the things that are huge at a national media level and social media level always the same things that you run into as local political operators and local campaigners? And do those maybe like checkmate some of the things that you guys are doing at local levels as well, or do they sometimes not matter as much? What's your experience with that? And thank you for it, Rita.
Sure, yeah, touch on that. I mean, sometimes, you know, being in a more small town, rural area, you probably are a bit more remote than things like, you know, if you're in Raleigh, you're probably on the forefront of a lot of things that are going on. Obviously, the George Floyd protest were very prevalent there when I lived there last year. We moved back here, so you see less of that. More in a small town, you have your own things going on. I mean, you run into people at the grocery store, and they know, you know, all about what's going on in the neighborhood. You run into different things. Specifically to CRT, I haven't seen that much here. We're also a, you know, 85% white, you know, community. So they're just, you know, we have some different cultural politics and different cultural things. The one thing I say to that, I have both grew up here in this, you know, white rural part of Appalachia. Have also worked for a civil rights organization right after college in Washington, D.C. I'm sort of somebody who gets to understand both of those worlds and both of those viewpoints. And what disappoints me is I feel like we're talking past one another on so many of these issues. So, you know, living in a state like North Carolina that has never had a Black governor or Black U.S. senators, or you go to the state capitol and all of the monuments around the state capitol are to people who fought in the Confederacy, you probably do feel like, look, a lot of our history that is being told doesn't, you know, if you're a young African-American student, you probably feel like a lot of this history, I don't see myself in it. I want to have a more complex and thorough, you know, discussion of our history. And then also you're on the other side of it. You feel like, look, okay, maybe I would understand that if that was presented to me in that way. I don't want people talking down the country and feeling like this is not a good place to live, or we should be ashamed to live in this country. So I feel like if we actually sit down in conversations like these, discuss the details of what we're actually trying to do, I feel like you'd have a whole lot more agreement and understanding. Unfortunately, a lot of people in politics feel like they can play into these divisions and get people riled up as a way of getting more attention to themselves. And so, you know, they bring out the worst in people, where, you know, these organizations were trying to bring out, you know, the braver angels and the best. So that's my sort of perspective on it. We haven't seen a whole lot of that here locally, but, you know, hopefully we can try to work it out if we do, and we'll hear what Elizabeth has to say.
Thank you, Michael. Elizabeth?
So my answer is going to be a little bit different because I live just outside Seattle, and thus we get a lot of the influence from Seattle. And I can tell you that critical race theory, as the right calls it, or anti-racism / diversity, equity, and inclusion, as it is better known on the left, has been beating me over the head for the last probably 3 years at this point. This is not new to me. This has been a push in the corporate world for the last several years. I have multiple friends that text me on a at least weekly basis complaining about the new anti-racist training that they had to go through this week. In my opinion, it is something that is extremely toxic and something that I have to face on a very regular basis. It is being taught explicitly in my local school district in the city where I live. The school board director actually sent out an email explaining in pretty explicit terms how the different books that they recommended reading, including Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, and White Fragility flew around my community as recommended reading a couple of years ago. At the south end of the county, this is not something that the school board has been pushing, but it is something that I have school board candidates running to oppose explicitly. And it is something that on the south end of the county, the majority of families are against. It is because there is kind of an economic strata there, not just kind of, there is an extreme economic strata there. It's interesting to see the working class communities are the ones that are really pushing back against quote unquote anti-racism, critical race theory, whereas the very well off white collar class that is, in all honesty, more white than the working class community is completely accepting of it, is largely accepting of it and promoting it and advocating for it. And if you are unwilling to concede ground, they will make your life miserable. They will be very upset at you, and you will be treated very, very poorly by people that you voice any sort of antipathy to against anti-racism. It's I have a lot to say. I think that it is an extremely bad ideology. I think it divides us by race when we should be working together as individuals, when we should be able to recognize each other as individuals and as a community, regardless of race. But I grew up in the same era as Coleman Hughes, and I generally agree with him on these things. I grew up with friends of multiple races, and I never thought of them as my friends of color. I dated a guy that was Taiwanese. I never thought of that as an interracial relationship until now in 2021, when the people pushing anti-racism have made me think about it in that way. I never actually needed to do so. That's getting a little bit off track. I know I can see Luke starting to drag me back here. But all of that to say that it is absolutely an issue in my local community, and it has not just sprung up overnight. This is something that has been an issue in my life and my friends' lives for several years.
Well, and I wanted to say, Rita, thank you for bringing that question. And I think on some of the levels that Mike was talking about earlier, how there's a way in which you have your politics, you have your practical institutional reformism and policy stuff, but then you also have your culture and your social norms and your kind of mass movement things and the way things are valued and different values are assessed in society. And I think at some level, one of the big things that I have been taking away from this conversation is that those are two very different things, but they're both political in a way. You know, they're both important, even though they operate in different structural and institutional frameworks, and you probably also need different skill sets and different languages to navigate them. And maybe there's a sense, and Michael and Elizabeth, maybe this is a conversation we should talk about sometime in the future too. There's a way in which, like, you get to some of these other questions of, to what degree do you need agreement on like the cultural and the social stuff before you can do practical politics? Or is it possible for people to do practical politics even when they don't have any fundamental agreement on those things? I don't know. It's making me it's making me think. And so Rita, I appreciate you bringing the topic up. And Michael and Elizabeth, I think you guys' answers to this to it are illuminating in some very key ways that frankly I'll be mulling over for a little bit. So thank you for that. Let's take a question from Fred Golder real quick.
Yeah, skin color is a genetic thing, has nothing to do with intelligence, morality, or anything else. So I'm trying to understand, how did we get into this black-white thing, since there actually aren't any people that have black skin or white skin?
Thank you for the question, Fred. I think it's important. I also think this I'd like to spend the remainder of this particular conversation on things a little bit closer to the topic. But thank you for it. And there will be more Braver Angels events and forums and workshops that cover questions of race and how to think about race in the future. And so we will be in touch via the emails on that soon too. So let me take a question from Sasha. Sasha.
Hi. My question is sort of personal relevance to me. I live in Boston and I grew up in DC, so I've only ever lived in pretty big cities, and I've always wanted to be more involved in local politics, but when I've tried, I've found it inaccessible in a variety of ways. And I'm curious, I know, Michael, you've sort of worked in a variety of areas of politics, and Elizabeth, you are close to Seattle, and I'm curious to hear you reflect a little bit on the differences between small town politics and city politics, and are there meaningful ways to be engaged on a local level, even if you live in a big city where a lot of national issues sort of come in? So this touches on the critical race theory question. Yeah, you have any advice for becoming more actively involved on a local level, even in a big city?
Yes, absolutely. And I see that Elizabeth has a friend with her. I can't wait to hear the name. But real quick on that, I remember when I was in college, it was like 2006. I went to the local, party headquarters there. 2006 midterm was going on, and I'm like, I would love to get involved. And they had this, they had this sign up board there. If you want to volunteer, write down your email. And I'm like, I hope they get back to me. Of course they're going to get back to you. They're looking for anybody, to help that can. If you're, in the community that you're in, if you show up to meetings, if you go and you talk to people, I mean, they probably, I'm sure there are planning boards and boards of adjustment and things like that. The smaller the community, the easier it is probably to get on those. But if you show up to the local meetings and things like that, there are no shortage of opportunities to do real tangible things like, how do we pick up trash? How can we volunteer to do things in the neighborhood and things like that. So and those are the real fulfilling things right now to get involved in, and the things that we pretty much agree on. Cleaning up the parks and making sure that we're doing the local stuff. I like those are fulfilling, and I think those are easy ways to get involved, and I would really encourage that. But find out what's going on, see what the calendar is for your city or your town. Just go and show up. You'll find people to talk to. They'll let you know how to get involved, whether that's just the strictly volunteer stuff, or the political candidate may have ways to get involved with them. So I would really encourage that, and you get a whole lot out of it. And yeah.
So I think there are a multitude of options, even in big cities. Primarily, you can get involved with nonprofits that affect various pieces of your city government, or that affect various issues within your city. Or you can actually still attend city council meetings and testify at those. Even city council districts are still usually much more influenceable in big cities than, say, a congressional race. Sometimes they are more partisan than others, and it can be difficult to feel like your voice is actually being heard. And that's why I would recommend getting involved with a nonprofit instead. So in Seattle, for example, there are a lot of interesting homeless nonprofits, and some of them are better than others, and some of them do better work than others, and they work toward different ends along different pathways. And there are some really interesting ones that I have friends that have been heavily involved with, doing needle cleanups, actually working with addicts, working with recovery, and getting people into very low-level jobs, ensuring that they continue to show up at those, or doing housing first, pursuing housing first initiatives, but from a private sector side, organizing tiny housing and privately owned property. And then you have other things that you could get involved on a community level within big cities. I don't know how it is where you are, but around Seattle, there are all sorts of little communities. There's Lake City, there is Fremont, there are, you've got downtown, you've got Pioneer Square, you've got Soto, of all of these different micro communities in Ballard. And each of those have nonprofit organizations and or city committees dedicated to, as Michael mentioned, things like cleaning up parks, things like keeping the crime rate down or trying to push the crime rate down, dedicated to identifying what exactly is going on in their tiny piece of the community and letting city council know so that that can actually, so that they can work toward changing that going forward, or contacting the correct people within the city to make things change. Whether that is your trash pickup or your police or whatever it might be. Some of those are organized through your homeowners associations, and some of them have independent nonprofits that you mostly would find probably by talking to a homeowner that lives in that neighborhood.
There could probably be a whole another conversation done on the political realism or political realism for nonprofit workers, right? And for people who are policy activists, but not necessarily working in government, just working around government. Actually, I feel like there's probably, that would possibly be something fascinating that some Washington, DC insiders would be able to talk to as well, too, on this front. So this is, Michael and Elizabeth, you guys are just giving me even more ideas for future programming on this, while also helping me and helping everybody here think about some of these issues too. So thank you for this. Let's take a last question from Kay Furlani, and then we will get towards the wrap up for the evenings. Okay.
Yeah, I just want to say that one of the thoughts I had while this conversation was going about, that seems to be kind of a local versus a more national involvement with things. And one of the things that strikes me about that is that I think we as people tend to kind of approach things differently. Some of us approach things on a more broader level or global level, and others are more able to approach things on a more local level. And I know for myself personally, that has been over the years one of my kind of struggles, because my initial involvement in any kind of political activity, which goes back about 40 years, was on the national level. That I became, first of all, involved in an organization that addressed a particular issue, and the particular issue that it addressed was hunger. And I became very involved in that organization. And then on a local level, I was like a district coordinator for my congressional district, and then identified people in the district who were members of this organization, and we would get together and learn together and act together politically. And we met regularly, I would say 3 to 4 times a year, with our member of Congress at that time. So I think that that's all, really important. And I think organizations like what you're talking about, Elizabeth, really can help us get involved, both on if it's a national thing, but also, on a more local opportunity, and then there are always local organizations. Like very recently, I've become involved with a more local organization in my county that's addressing issues in my particular county, so I just wanted to share that. So I really didn't have a question about that, because I think Elizabeth and Michael have answered the questions that I had around that. Thank you.
Well, it's a very helpful addition, Kay, and thank you for it. In that case, I'm going to ask Michael and Elizabeth one final question, and then we'll get to the closeout things. But I have a copy of Plunkitt of Tammany Hall by George Washington Plunkitt, a political machine guy of the late 19th century. And he has a fascinating quote that I couldn't find the direct version of in here, so I'm paraphrasing. But his quote that I'm going to ask you to respond to as your final statements is, he said something along the lines of, there is a world of difference between honest graft and dishonest graft. Dishonest graft is when a politician just enriches himself, and honest graft is when a politician enriches himself, his party, and his country. And I am just kind of curious, what is your initial reaction to those based on your long experience in politics, working with possibly some practitioners of both honest and dishonest graft?
I'm a Republican, so very true is my response. We like people to make money, and we're happy to support people that honestly make money by being effective at their jobs. So I've worked with a couple of consultants that I really like and that I think are actually good at their jobs, and they elect people and or get very close to electing people in districts that are extraordinarily difficult to elect Republicans in. And not just Republicans, sometimes they'll also promote, a moderate Democrat who they think has a good shot of being a viable candidate. And then there is the other end of the spectrum. Not to name names, but I could send you a whole Substack about the campaign manager for our gubernatorial candidate this year, who really, really, really represents the latter.
We will not ask you to name.
If you are terrible at your job, you don't help the party, you don't advance your principles, you advance absolutely none of the goals that you claim that you want to advance, and you make absolutely no progress, you fail miserably in even attempting to gain election, and all you actually manage to do is somehow make almost 7 figures off of a campaign, I tend to look, and then you lie to people along the way about the chances of that happening and also how you are accomplishing that. I have absolutely zero respect for you, and I think of you as a dishonorable graft or grifter for sure.
Thank you for that, Elizabeth, and thank you for being here with us tonight. Michael.
There certainly is a whole lot of grifters in politics these days, and hopefully we can, shun them out and get back to more honest graft. I think that harkens back to, it goes back to before civil service reform, the spoils system, to where if your party got elected, your volunteers got the job with the Department of Transportation and things like that. That was a somewhat corrupt system, but also it was a more it made politics a game. And if you lost the game, okay, we'll go and compete next time. We're not going to storm the Capitol. If we lose this game, we're just going to be out of a job. That system had its own flaws, but there's something to be said for it in hindsight. I didn't know. I'm ashamed I didn't know about this book, this Plunkitt book, until a couple months ago. I found it in a used bookstore, the Plunkitt of Tammany Hall. It's all about this guy who was the ward healer for Tammany Hall in New York City. Half the book is him complaining about civil service reform, but the other half, there's some interesting insight. And one of the quotes, I wrote it down, the only way to hold a district, you must study human nature and act according. But just as we talked about the relational aspect of politics, just people are people, and if you want to affect change and get things done, you have to understand it's just you're dealing with people. I think that there's a whole lot to be learned from that, and in this moment that we're living in. We're more divided now than at any time in history, but we're not divided about issues. We're divided about culture and geography and things like that, and just finding ways to come together and work together as human beings and see the best and the worst in us, and maybe forgive some of that and look to the best, I think would be a powerful thing to do.
Well, thank you for that, Michael, and thank you for being here too. And thank you all for joining us for 2 hours on a weekday evening to go talk about political minority status on some hand and political realism and even political corruption on other hands. This has been a fun conversation for me to be in. I've appreciated every bit of it. I've appreciated all the questions here too, and I just want to thank everybody for joining us for it. So, but first off, let's give a round of jazz hands for Elizabeth and Michael. Elizabeth and Michael, thank you guys for being with us. Thank you guys for being with us here, and also having the candor to talk about these things at the depth that you have been. And also, let's give a round of jazz hands to my two Zoom staff here tonight, Sasha Rickard and Dennis Smith. Thank you guys for keeping this practical and real from the back end. I much appreciate it. And again, thank you to all of you for joining us here this evening as well too. Now, a couple things real quick. I'll just do some last announcements before we close out. But as you saw this evening, this was a conversation that touched into some things that you might think of as gritty issues, right? They weren't necessarily the most kind of like country cutting issues by any means. They weren't necessarily the things that drive polarization. They were much more functional questions about the limits and the nature and the functioning of American government. And as we all heard, and as doubtless people in here thought at some points and sometimes vocalized, there are unseemly aspects to that. And one of the things that we in the America's Public Forum program really do sincerely believe is that these kinds of conversations should be had as frankly and honestly as possible out in the open, both for the sake of just general public understanding, just general public knowledge of the way our system works and of the ways we all relate to it, but also for the sake of helping people who work in America's systems of government, America's systems of scholarship and journalism, and those of us who work in the grassroots and in the activist communities and who just come to these events from our hometowns. To be able to have these conversations and be able to have a sense of what people on the other sides of these divides think and how people on the other sides of these divides understand things. For my money, I think that's one of the most important things that has to be done, not only for the American political system, but also for pretty much every divide that divides Americans at different levels and in different parts of the country from each other. And so what should you think of this event? This wasn't a particular. This was in some ways maybe an exploration of some things. In other ways, it was a discussion over some things. But I like to think it was a discussion of some of the most important things in American government at an honest and public level. And so, Elizabeth and Michael, thank you guys for being with us here for this. If you like what you saw tonight, and if you'd like to see more of it, and as I mentioned a couple times in this event tonight, I think there's going to be some more events like this exploring other parts of the American political culture media system that I think are worth looking at. If you like what you saw here, please feel free to follow us at Braver Angels. Sasha and Dennis have just put the links to Braver Angels in the chat, and also they have put the links to Mike and Elizabeth's Twitter accounts on the chat as well too, if you'd like to follow them and see what they are thinking sometimes as the modern Plunkitts that they are. And so they can so you can always follow their insight. And if you are interested in seeing more of this kind of thing, the America's Public Forum program happens every Wednesday evening. We'll probably be skipping a couple of them in the next month just as summer closes on us, but we'll be doing more of these further down the road. So we do Wednesday evenings, 8 p.m. We always have an interesting pool of speakers, and I'm looking forward to doing many more of these as well too. With all that being said, I appreciate everybody joining us tonight, and please follow us at Braver Angels if you'd like to see more of these kinds of things. We're always looking to work with more people, with more volunteers, with more partners, and to explore more subjects. The America's Public Forum is not the only thing we do in Braver Angels. We do a series of workshops and debates and other things that have different ways to participate in them, and we're always looking for more people to come and join us in making this work available to more Americans, especially as we approach the next series of elections, and especially as we go further into America's future. So with all that, I look forward to working Elizabeth, Michael, Sasha, Dennis, with you all on more things, and with many more of you here in this room as we march forward to build a house united. So thank you all for joining us this evening, and have a wonderful night. I will see you all on future America's Public Forum.
One more thought. that I thought you all would enjoy to close us out, which is I neglected to name my cat who jumped up here earlier. My cat's name is Theodore Moose Roosevelt Dahl Ferguson the first and probably last, also known as Teddy.
It's a wonderful name for a cat, and my cats do not have nearly as venerable names. But Elizabeth, thank you for being here, and with your cat as well. And Michael, thank you for being here. I will look forward to seeing you all soon. Have a wonderful night, everybody, and see you all sometime on a future APF.